welcome to this sixth episode of John's Gospel, a podcast in which Dr Adam Bradford is in conversation with his son, Dr Daniel Bradford. In this episode, Dr Bradford will be dealing with the feeding of the 5,000 and the miracle of calming the seas, and also discussing the conversations that Jesus was having with the Judean Jews, in which is introduced that famous saying, "I am the bread of life." And Dr Bradford will be explaining what Jesus meant by this. Dr Bradford was a senior GP and health commissioner in South London. He's a lifelong studier of the Bible and is particularly interested in looking at the New Testament in relation to its Jewish roots.
Well, hello again. We're looking at chapter 6 today. So, Dr. Bradford, why don't you set the scene for us? Tell us what's changed from chapter 5 to chapter 6.
Thank you. Yes, chapter 5, as we saw last time, is set in Jerusalem, around the pool of Bethesda, and it's mainly about Jesus teaching on the healing on the Sabbath, which was illegal, and his dispute with the Pharisees about the consequences of that and what it meant for him and his various people that were testifying to who he was, like the Bible and his miracles and things like that. But then we hit chapter 6 and we jumped forward in time and north in place to Galilee. And the reason for that is that what happened in Galilee is bang on theme for John's Gospel. Because John's Gospel, as we said before, was written to underline the fact that Jesus and not John the Baptist was the Messiah, and to also emphasize what the role of the Galileans, which is where, don't forget, Jesus was a Galilean, Nazareth was in Galilee, what the role of the Galileans were in recognizing both Jesus and Jesus' father Joseph. Because one of the other distinguishing things about Jesus was his dad was more important than John the Baptist's dad, because Joseph was a very well-known and very important Jew. If we don't get that, we don't know who Joseph was, we're going to have a really hard time understanding who Jesus was as a man. We may be able to accept that he was God, but do you really know who he was as a man? Because that is the person that the Gospels tell us about.
Okay, so here we are up north, and the chapter kicks off with probably my favourite miracle, which is the feeding of 5,000. Now, last week you were challenging me to not simply read the Bible from my sort of 21st century default modern Western perspective, but rather put myself in the shoes as a first century Jew. So, why don't you talk us through this miracle as though we're in the shoes of a first century Jew? What are we seeing here?
Well, the first thing to say is that, as Luke records towards the end of his gospel, Jesus was followed by massive crowds. And I'm talking about hundreds of thousands, not just 12 or 50 or even 100 people, but huge, huge crowds followed him, especially up in Galilee, where he was kind of like the local boy made good, come back from Jerusalem to teach stuff they couldn't hear in Galilee because they didn't have many temple scholars in Galilee. So he's followed by these huge crowds, so much so that Luke says people were treading one another and harming one another just to get near him. It's like a crowd control situation. And in this occasion, we have 5,000 men, probably as many women, and maybe even 15,000 kids. So we're talking about many tens of thousands of people who are all hungry. And Jesus wants to test one of his disciples, Philip. And so he asks Philip, "How are we going to get bread for this lot, Philip?" Now, Philip was local, which is why Jesus asked him that. And he was also obviously one of the apostles and had a test from Jesus, which sadly he failed.
Okay. So, now one thing I know is I've been to lots of sporting events. There are always crowds of people. And something that's always in common is there's always someone selling food. So is this what is going on here?
Yes. So what we see here is a young lad with loaves and fishes. And what you need to understand here is the word for loaf is the common word for a barley loaf, which was a dinner plate sized piece of flat bread, enough for 2 men. So he's got enough food there easily for 10 men.
Gosh.
So why is this young boy carrying enough food for 10 men? Is he Billy Bunter? Is it his lunch? What is going on here? Is he an example of first century giant obesity? Or is he selling food on behalf of his dad? Well, I think he was selling food to the crowd. Andrew saw him and said, there's a boy here with this amount of food, but how is that going to feed so many thousands of people? Very reasonable question.
And what do we get? Jesus just says, well, make everyone sit down. And then he takes the bread, he gives thanks and distributes it. And somehow they all eat and they're all satisfied. And there's even enough leftovers, more than they started with.
So the crowd of Galileans, who are all religious Jews, see this and immediately they think of Moses, who was the only other Jew in their history to do this sort of miracle, feed thousands of people with very little. Obviously, God poured out manna from heaven in the Exodus wilderness. And that's what they're thinking of when they see this bread being multiplied. They think of the bread in the wilderness and they think of Moses. And they think of what Moses said in Deuteronomy about the Lord God raising up a prophet like me, like Moses. And they think, well, this must be the prophet. This must be the Messiah.
Okay. So they say, surely this is the prophet who's come into the world. And it says they try to make him king by force.
Yeah, so good luck with that. So the Galileans were an unusual group of Jews.
Okay.
They were independently minded and quite militant and quite religious. But they were not corrupted in the way that a lot of the Judean Jews were by the Roman presence in the temple. They were the ones who usually went at festival time and started a riot because they didn't like something that the Judean Jews were doing in the south. So very regularly, you read about Galilean Jews, I'm talking about outside the Bible here, causing issues in Jerusalem because they were quite hard-nosed about their faith. But they loved Jesus, especially loved the free lunch. And they decide, actually, he's the Messiah, right, Jesus, we're going to make you officially the Messiah. But clearly that wasn't God the Father's timetable.
No, and we actually read on to see the confrontation between Jesus and these Jews and the long conversation that they have. But just before John brings us to that here, there's a bit of a hiatus where the disciples will set off across the Lake Galilee in a boat and get caught up in a storm. And Jesus comes out to them walking on water. So tell us what's going on here. If we're a disciple in the boat, what's going through our heads?
Well, you must remember that a lot of these guys were Galilean fishermen, so this was their home patch. Lake Galilee was notorious for its sudden storms due to the cold wind coming from the Golan Heights. So very quick flash storms were common, and a lot of people drowned. And their boat is getting flooded with water by the storm, and they are seriously concerned they are going to die. And then they see a figure walking across the water.
Walking on the water. So it's interesting. It says there's a strong wind, the waters grow rough, and they're rowing for miles. But it's when they see Jesus approaching them that they become frightened. Why is that?
Well, because they thought it was a ghost. And Jews believed, and a lot of them still believe, that when you die, an angel comes to take you the other side.
You're right.
So they thought it was their angels come to take them to death, to Sheol.
Yeah, gosh, I would be terrified. But Jesus gets into the boat with them, and then immediately, just like that, suddenly they're in a sunny harbour on the other side.
Yeah, so you see, what you see in this passage is Jesus' concern for his 12 disciples. You know, he walked out to them when he saw the storm came. And also God the Father's concern that he just moved them from A to B like he did with Philip in the book of Acts. Obviously, Jesus had a mission to fulfill. He saved the disciples' life. On to the next stage.
Yeah. That's really good. I'm sure I don't want to read into it too much, but I wonder if there's lessons that we can learn there for life. But then, as you say, on to the next stage. Here we have Jesus meeting the religious Jews who are attempting to make him king by force, who thought he was the prophet like Moses. And we have their conversation. It's a bit complicated, if I'm honest. I find it a bit confusing in places. There are some great one-liners, which I would love to cling to, but I think that's my Western bumper sticker approach. So if you read through it in the context of the first century, what's going on?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that these Jews immediately called Jesus Rabbi, thereby underlining the fact that Jesus was indeed an ordained Jewish scholar.
Okay.
So these are religious Jews who happen to live in the Roman capital, Capernaum, the capital city of Galilee, the Roman administrative headquarters. So they're very familiar with the Roman deals, and they also are familiar with Jesus.
Okay.
They call him Rabbi. They're very respectful. Many of them think he's the Messiah, obviously. Some of them aren't too certain. But they definitely know who he was as a man, and they definitely know who Joseph was, Jesus' dad. We can see that in verse 42. And Mary. So they are acquainted with Jesus' family. And the question you might ask is, how do they know Joseph and Mary in Capernaum, which is quite a ways from Nazareth? And the reason, I believe, is that Joseph was a major architect who worked, like all the Jewish architects at that time did, for the Romans. In other words, he had supervised the construction of Herod's temple and the training of the priests that built that temple, and Herod's son Antipas had appointed his father's architect for the major Roman defensive works at Sepphoris in Galilee, where a lot of these Galilean Jews would have been employed. So they knew Jesus both as a scholar from Jerusalem, a rabbi, and as Joseph's son. And this is very helpful for John, the writer of the Gospel, because he's going to use the connection that Joseph, the dad, had with Jesus, and parallel it with a connection that God the Father had with his son Jesus.
Okay, so they come to him. First, they address him as Rabbi, and Jesus sort of accuses them of really just looking for a free lunch.
Correct.
Okay. And then they start talking about, or Jesus rather, talks about work and labour.
Yeah.
What's the significance of that?
Right, so Jesus says, well, actually all you guys really want is food in your belly. But he says what you should be concerned about is work that will last forever. Okay, work for food that spoils. Don't work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man, which is another Messianic title from Daniel, will give you. On him, God the Father, brackets, not Joseph my father, whom you know, verse 42, has placed his seal of approval. Then the Jews asked Jesus, what must we do to do the works of God? Which there in Greek means the labour of God, which could easily in that context mean the construction work of God, if they'd been doing the construction work under Joseph under Roman pay in Galilee, in Sepphoris, which a lot of them probably were, and they knew about the temple of God as being a work of God in Jerusalem, which Joseph had overseen, and the temple was a very, very, very famous building. That would be a construction work of God, or a labour of God, or for God. So the context there is employment around a person called Father, whom Jesus is introducing as God the Father, but in the context of whom they knew Joseph to be as his father.
Was Joseph involved in any other sort of construction work up in that neck of the woods?
Well, I feel certain that he was, but really we may be getting off the topic here.
Okay.
So Jesus is trying to get the Jews to recognize that he's not simply there to give them a free lunch, but he's there to teach them about something that God wants them to know, which is about faith in him, which although they recognize him as Messiah to the point of wanting to make him king by force, they hadn't yet reached the point of saving faith or trust in him as God. They had to make the jump from, here's this local boy who we all know about, whose dad is so well known, to recognizing that Jesus was God, because that is what John is trying to get across, that Jesus is not an ordinary man, he is God, made man.
Okay. So they ask him for evidence. They say, what sign will you give us that we might see it and believe you? And they say, well, our ancestors ate manna. What evidence are you going to give us? We've been at verse 30, 31. And then Jesus' response comes.
Yeah, Jesus answers them by telling them again who he is. He says, and it's the very first proper I am statement in John's Gospel, verse 35, Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. He's using Hebrew there, obviously he's not speaking in Greek, and he's using the name Yahweh in the sense that God, Yahweh himself spoke to Moses, tell them the I am sent you. And that was illegal. And it was a lot worse for a scholar, a rabbi, to say something apparently blasphemous like that would have been for a peasant carpenter and nobody to say it. But these Jews take Jesus extremely seriously. They don't try and kill him, which the Judean Jews are trying to do, but they say, you're telling us that you're God. We find that hard to accept.
Oh, right. That's a very interesting different perspective that they take. As if they're struggling to believe Jesus. It says their response is they start to grumble. They say, well, hang on, this is the Jesus whose father and mother we know, as you said. And so we're looking down here at verse 43 onwards, and Jesus says, stop grumbling. He goes on to talk about the manna, but how that was food that perished, that the Israelites ate it and yet they still died. Yet whoever eats of Jesus' flesh won't die, will have life. Because he says, I am the living bread, and whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh. That's verse 51.
Yes. So, and what you find is when you read most commentators is that they say that this somehow is the prefiguration of Eucharistic teaching in the Gospels, which I want to tell you is nonsense. So the Eucharist, the communion, was introduced by Jesus in a very specific context, being the Seder meal of the Jewish Passover feast.
Sure.
So this is not Passover, this is not a Seder meal, this is a rabbi teaching a group of religious Jews about himself being God, which they find hard to accept because they couldn't accept that he was God. But then he makes it harder still by extrapolating from that and saying, it's so important that you trust me, that you take me in by eating my flesh and drinking my blood, which does kind of echo the Eucharist, the communion, but isn't about that. It's simply a rabbinic device for stressing them to the point, challenging them to the point they either have to reject him or accept him, because it's a very extreme way of saying, I'm God and you take me into yourself as God. And the concept of drinking blood was and still is very, very offensive to Jews. It was illegal for a start, and the idea that Jesus would be offering them his flesh and blood was unacceptable to them on religious grounds. And that is why they're grumbling and murmuring and complaining, because Jesus has gone outside the window of what is acceptable from a religious teacher's point of view in saying that he's God, and in saying that unless they eat his flesh and drink his blood, they will die.
Interesting. So they could just about cope with him saying, I am the bread of life, saying that legal statement. But then suddenly when he starts pushing them further about, you must eat my flesh, it says in verse 52, the Jews began to argue sharply among themselves. So you can see he's been very divisive here. And Jesus then pushes them even more. He reiterates verse 56, whoever eats... verse 55, for my flesh is real food and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them.
Yeah. So it's important to recognize that Jesus is actually teaching in the synagogue when he says this, verse 59. So he's speaking as a rabbi officially in the synagogue. He's not on the mountain teaching a bunch of peasants. He's teaching a bunch of religious Jews in their synagogue. So they would have been used to rabbis using extreme examples to make a point. But Jesus goes beyond extreme into downright offensive and illegal, because he didn't want a group of Jews following him who weren't convinced about who he was and really only wanted a free meal. So he pushes them and pushes them and pushes them to the point which they reject him. Deliberately, because he didn't want them trying to make him king by force.
And you can see that manifest itself in verse 66. From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. And in verse 60, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?
Yeah. So, in that passage, towards the end of the chapter, we're back to Jesus talking to them about the Father. And you need to remember that Jesus used rabbinic teaching methods as a rabbi, and one of the main rabbinic teaching devices was double meanings. Okay. These guys in Capernaum knew Joseph. We see that in verse 42. But they weren't intimately acquainted with Joseph. Joseph was the senior Roman architect. These guys would have worked on the project in an untrained way, probably a lot of them, under the supervision of someone immensely superior to them called Joseph. Jesus is able to dance back and forth between Joseph, whom they think they know but don't really know personally, whom Jesus obviously does know because he's his son, and God the Father, who he's saying you don't know him either. You haven't seen this form or image. You don't know who I'm talking about even, but I want to introduce you to him. But you have to expand your mind and take into yourself concepts that you haven't even thought about yet, which is taking God inside yourself, which is what Jesus died on the cross to enable us to do. Come to faith in his death as a means of saving us from hell. And that was a big stretch from the local boy Meg whose dad and mum you know, to recognizing him as the incarnate Son of God, the God-man, that impossible miracle of the incarnation where somebody who you know to be human because you're living with him turns out to actually be God. And that is one of the main reasons John is writing this gospel, to emphasize that Jesus was God. That's why all the I am statements are in it. I am the bread of life is just one example. I am the light of the world, and there are 5 more. Because Jesus was God. He wasn't simply a rabbi. He wasn't simply the son of Joseph, a famous architect. He was God incarnate. And in the late 90s AD, a lot of Jews didn't know that because he'd been crucified, and they could find it very hard to accept that a crucified Jewish man was anything other than cursed. And John the Baptist hadn't been crucified, he'd been executed. He was a good Jew in their book. Jesus, by the 90s, for a lot of Jews, was a bad Jew. If he'd been a good Jew, he would not have been crucified.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. So John is really making the point that Jesus is the Messiah, is the source of life. He says, your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread, i.e. myself, will live forever, as Jesus speaking, and you get Simon Peter's answer at the end.
Yeah. So John cuts back to the 12 at the end, the very end of the chapter, after many of his disciples who were Galileans had left and gone home to their local area because they couldn't cope with the bread of life and having to eat and drink blood. Jesus asked the 12, including the Apostle John, do you want to go away as well? Simon says, well, you got the words of eternal life, and we believe, we trust and know. So we don't just trust, we don't just have faith, we know that you are the Holy One of God, the Messiah. And Jesus replies, well, I've chosen 12 of you, yet one of you is a diabolos. And sadly, that's another example of mistranslation where all the Bibles come and stick devil there, when actually it simply is the Greek word for slanderer, not devil, but one who opposes somebody through speaking against them. And he's speaking there about Judas, we're told, who was an Iscari, and Judas Iscariot, the Iscari, the religious Jews who regularly spoke against, even killed, Jews who they believed to be too cozy with the Romans. So Jesus is back in his home area of Galilee, dominated by Roman construction, populated by Jews who worked for the Romans, including his dad Joseph. Some of the religious Jews didn't like that because they thought it was too cozy to the Romans, and they spoke against it. And one of them was Judas, who Jesus and the Father in heaven had selected for that very reason, to bring Jesus to death.
All right. It's quite a chapter. Full of all sorts. So we've had the miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, and then some. We've had this miraculous calming of the storm and arrival at your destination. And we've got this conversation between Jesus and his, now ex-followers.
that concludes this 6th episode of John's Gospel. Dr. Bradford has written a number of books which are available from Temple House Publishing. These can be obtained online by going to www.templehouse-publishing.com.